He didn't speak a word for 400 days. Not a whisper, not a sigh. Just silence. Then, in one extraordinary moment, a baby fox curled into his arms, and everything changed. This is the story of Marcus, a man who locked away his voice after unimaginable loss, and the tiny, wild creature that somehow found the key. What happened in that cabin in the woods wasn't just unusual. It would challenge everything we understand about healing, connection, and the power of unexpected encounters. The cabin stood alone, nestled deep in the forest, where the outside world couldn't intrude. Its weathered wooden exterior had grown to resemble the ancient trees surrounding it, forgotten, steadfast, bearing the silent weight of time. Inside, Marcus moved through his daily routine like a ghost, methodical, silent, barely there at all. The floorboards no longer creaked beneath his careful steps. Even his body had learned the language of silence. 400 days earlier, he had been different. A wildlife photographer whose laughter echoed through these same woods as he captured images that made people fall in love with the natural world. His photographs graced magazine covers and gallery walls, intimate portraits of creatures rarely seen, moments of wild beauty frozen in time. His wife Elena had been his partner in every sense, his guide, his editor, his heart. She'd been the one who could spot the eagle's nest that his trained eye had missed, who knew exactly when to whisper now, for the perfect shot of a fox emerging from its den. "You don't just see the animals, Marcus," she once told him, her eyes reflecting the campfire between them. "You see their souls." Her words had filled him with purpose, with pride. But that was before the cliff edge. Before the perfect shot he insisted on getting, a rare mountain lion at dawn, perched on an outcropping that required them to venture to the precipice of the ravine. Before Elena reached out to steady him when he leaned too far, and instead, the memory still hit him like a physical blow. Her scream, the impossible moment of suspension, the sickening realization in her eyes, the silence that followed, the desperate scramble down treacherous rocks, the broken body he cradled, begging her to stay, while her blood soaked into the earth beneath them. The authorities called it a tragic accident. They said no one was to blame. Friends attempted comfort with hollow phrases. She died doing what she loved. She wouldn't want you to blame yourself. But Marcus knew better. He had led her there. He had been careless. His voice had been the last thing she heard, calling her name as she fell, then screaming it into the canyon until his throat was raw. So he silenced it, forever. The day after her funeral, he packed what little mattered, drove to their remote cabin, and locked the world away. He communicated with the outside world only through handwritten notes left for the delivery person who brought his supplies each month. Even his breathing had grown quieter, as if apologizing for continuing when hers had stopped. For 400 days, not a single word had passed his lips. No phone calls, no human contact, just the rhythmic scratching in his journal. Day 267, still silent. Day 341, still silent. Day 399, still silent. At night, he would sometimes open the leather portfolio of their work, his photographs, her words. His fingers would trace her handwriting, feeling the indentations her pen had made in the paper. Even then, his grief remained soundless, tears falling without sobs, pain expressed without voice. He had made his peace with this existence, this penance, this slow disappearance from the world. The seasons had cycled without his acknowledgement. Spring, summer, fall, winter, and spring again. The calendar on his wall remained untouched, frozen on the last day they had been together. But as the 400th day of silence approached, nature had other plans for the man who refused to speak. The first sign was the change in air. heaviness that settled in Marcus's lungs as he stepped onto the porch at dawn. His ritual morning coffee paused halfway to his lips as he scanned the horizon. There, beyond the western ridge, a smudge of gray stained the otherwise perfect blue. Smoke. His fingers tightened around the ceramic mug, its warmth suddenly incongruous with the chill that spread through his body. Wildfire season had come early this year, after months of drought had transformed the lush forest into a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The rangers had posted warnings throughout the area before he'd cut himself off from the world. One of the last pieces of information he'd absorbed before his self-imposed exile. By midday, the sky had transformed. What began as a distant haze now painted the heavens in apocalyptic hues. Amber and ash gray, swirling together as the sun struggled to penetrate the thickening veil. The forest fire that authorities had been monitoring for days in the national forest had jumped containment lines overnight. Now it devoured everything in its path with indiscriminate hunger. Marcus watched from his rooftop, binoculars trained on the advancing wall of flame. He'd witnessed wildfires before, had even photographed them from helicopters for environmental journals, but never had one threaten to consume his sanctuary. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 400 days of emotional numbness, it would be fire that finally forced him to feel something. The wind shifted, carrying the unmistakable scent of burning pine and the distant roar that sounded almost like ocean waves. If oceans were made of destruction, Marcus calculated distances, wind direction, potential fire breaks. The creek that ran behind his property might provide some protection, but if the drought weakened trees on the other side caught, nothing would stop the flames from reaching his cabin. He should leave. The rational part of his mind knew this. The evacuation orders had likely been issued hours ago, though his self-imposed isolation meant he'd received no warning. His truck had enough gas to make it to town. Yet he remained, watching, waiting. Perhaps this was fitting. The world he'd retreated to burning away just as surely as the life he once had. In his previous life, he would have already been gone. Not fleeing, but driving toward the fire, camera in hand, documenting the terrible beauty of nature's most destructive force. Elena would have been beside him, her notebook filled with observations that would later become the lyrical prose accompanying his images. They had built their reputation on capturing moments of transition in the natural world. Birth, death, destruction, renewal. Now he stood paralyzed, unable to document or flee, suspended between action and surrender. As afternoon surrendered to evening, the forest came alive with desperate movement. The inhabitants of the wilderness, driven by instinct and terror, began to flee toward the creek. Marcus watched from his porch as deer bounded past in small groups, their white tails flashing alarm. A family of raccoons scurried across his yard without their usual caution. Birds darkened the smoke-filled sky in chaotic patterns, their migration forced months ahead of schedule. A massive bull elk, one Marcus recognized from countless encounters, distinguished by a notch in his left antler, paused at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. The animal's chest heaved with exertion, its magnificent rack silhouetted against the smoke-stained sky. Then, with a dignified turn, it disappeared into the trees, heading east, away from the advancing flames. For the first time in over a year, Marcus felt something crack within his chest. Not just fear, but a profound sadness for these creatures whose homes were vanishing in flame and smoke. These were the very beings he had once devoted his life to capturing through his lens, whose existence had given his own meaning. Now they ran for their lives while he stood witness, mute and motionless. The night brought no relief. Darkness only made the approaching inferno more visible. A ravenous orange line consuming the ridge, casting an unnatural glow across the landscape. The forest that had sheltered Marcus in his grief was dying, and with it, perhaps the last connection he had to the world before Elena's death. Inside his cabin, shadows danced on the walls, projected by the distant flames. The light pulsed like a living thing, breathing and hungry. Marcus moved through the rooms, touching objects as if saying goodbye. The handcrafted table where he and Elena had shared countless meals. The bookshelf overflowing with field guides and photography collections. The quilt her grandmother had made that still carried traces of her scent if he buried his face in it deeply enough. Sleep was impossible. Marcus paced his cabin, gathering the few possessions he couldn't bear to lose. Elena's journals, their portfolios, the hard drives containing thousands of photographs. He filled containers with water and placed them around the perimeter of the cabin in a futile gesture of protection. The fire was still miles away, but its presence filled every moment, every breath. His camera bag sat by the door, untouched since that day. Now his hands reached for it almost of their own accord, muscle memory guiding his fingers as they checked batteries, lenses, memory cards. For a moment, he stood suspended between past and present, the weight of the camera both familiar and foreign in his hands. Then he set it back down. Some habits died harder than others. The hours crawled by, marked only by the advancing glow on the horizon and the occasional crash of falling trees in the distance. Marcus found himself standing before the small shrine he'd created for Elena. Her photograph surrounded by dried wildflowers she had loved. Her favorite silver bracelet. The river stone shaped like a heart they'd found on their first date. His lips moved in shapes that might have been words if he had allowed them voice. Near dawn, exhausted from his vigilance, Marcus collapsed into the rocking chair on his porch. The fire had advanced steadily through the night, but a fortunate shift in wind had slowed its march toward his property. The reprieve would be temporary. Nature's cleansing fury would not be denied for long. The air had grown nearly unbreathable, thick with ash and particulate matter that coated his lungs with each inhale. His eyes burned despite the wet cloth he'd tied around the lower half of his face. The world had narrowed to shades of gray and orange, the normal colors of dawn obliterated by smoke and cinder. As the first gray light of morning filtered through the smoke, movement at the tree line caught his eye. Marcus reached for his binoculars, focusing on the edge of the forest where his cleared land began. What he saw made his heart, that organ he thought long dormant, suddenly lurch in his chest. A small, flame-colored form stumbled from the underbrush, its movements erratic and desperate. A fox kit barely past its infancy, its russet fur singed black in places, one ear bleeding. It collapsed at the border between forest and clearing, its tiny sides heaving with exhaustion. Behind it, no mother fox appeared, no siblings, just the advancing wall of fire that had claimed everything else. Marcus was on his feet before conscious thought could form. For the first time in 400 days, his body moved with purpose, with urgency. The distance between porch and forest edge disappeared beneath his running feet, his lungs burning with smoke and exertion. What Marcus found at the edge of his property would challenge the very foundation of his silent existence. The fox kit lay trembling in Marcus's hands, its tiny body radiating heat that had nothing to do with the approaching fire. Infection, most likely. The burns along its flank angry and weeping. Its eyes, amber like the flames consuming the forest, fixed on Marcus with a mixture of fear and exhaustion too profound for such a young creature. The delicate creature couldn't weigh more than a few pounds, its once vibrant russet fur now matted with ash and blood, telling the story of a desperate flight through burning underbrush. Back inside the cabin, Marcus worked with the efficiency of desperation. He cleared his kitchen table with one sweep of his arm, ancient instincts overriding the careful, measured movements that had defined his silent year. Water boiled on the stove while he gathered supplies, the first aid kit from beneath the bathroom sink, the soft cotton towels Elena had insisted on buying despite their impracticality in a cabin, the honey they'd collected from a local beekeeper last spring. He'd read once that honey had natural antibacterial properties. Whether that applied to fox kits, he had no idea. But it was all he had. He cleaned the wounds with antiseptic from his first aid kit, wincing at the kit's weak cries. The fox couldn't be more than 8 weeks old enough to have left the den but far too young to survive alone, especially injured and with its world burning around it. Its ribs were visible beneath the singed fur, suggesting it had been separated from its mother for days before the fire had driven it to his doorstep. With gentle fingers that remembered how to be tender despite the months of disuse, Marcus extracted tiny splinters of wood and thorns embedded in the kit's pads. Each touch seemed to establish a fragile thread of trust between them, the fox initially flinching away, then gradually surrendering to his ministrations, perhaps recognizing its only chance for survival lay in this strange human's hands. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. After hundreds of days of deliberate isolation, of choosing silence and solitude, the universe had sent him a creature that needed precisely what he had rejected: care, connection, voice. The fox kit required a guardian who would speak to it in soothing tones, who would reach out to wildlife experts for advice, who would re-enter the world of human interaction. Everything Marcus had vowed never to do again. As he wrapped the smallest of his bandages around the kit's injured leg, a memory surfaced. Elena kneeling beside an injured hawk they'd found during a hike in Yellowstone. "Sometimes the best photographs are the ones we never take," she'd said, carefully splinting the bird's wing. "Sometimes we're meant to be participants instead of observers." He'd captured her profile in that moment anyway. The concentration in her eyes, the gentle determination in her hands. That photograph had won him awards, but the lesson behind it had been lost until now. The fox kit whimpered, bringing Marcus back to the present. He'd created a makeshift nest from an old sweater of Elena's, something he would have considered sacrilege just hours ago. Now it seemed like the most natural thing in the world, as if her essence might somehow transfer to this wounded creature, might help heal what his limited skills could not. He'd chosen her favorite, the soft blue cashmere that matched her eyes, that still held the faint scent of the lavender soap she'd always used. His fingers lingered on the fabric, remembering how it had draped across her shoulders, how she'd laughingly protested when he'd given it to her. "It's too expensive for traipsing through the wilderness," but had worn it constantly thereafter. Using an eyedropper from his camera cleaning kit, Marcus carefully administered water to the dehydrated kit, watching with satisfaction as its tiny pink tongue worked eagerly despite its weakness. He mixed water with a small amount of the protein powder he kept for emergencies, not ideal fox food, but it might provide enough strength to get them to safety. Outside, the fire's voice grew louder. The wind had shifted again, and with it, time had compressed. What had seemed like hours of safety had dwindled to minutes. Through the window, Marcus could see the first fingers of flame reaching the trees at the far edge of his property. The creek wouldn't be enough to stop it. Nothing would. The cabin that had been his refuge, his purgatory, his self-imposed prison, would soon be reduced to ash and memory. The thought should have devastated him, But as he looked down at the vulnerable creature in his care, Marcus felt something unexpected, a lightness, almost a relief, as if the approaching fire was burning away not just the physical structure, but the walls he'd built around his heart. The decision that had seemed impossible to make for himself now became crystal clear with the fox kit's life in his hands. They had to leave. Now. With practiced movements that belied his year of inactivity, Marcus gathered his emergency pack: water, food, first aid supplies, matches, compass. Elena's journals went into a waterproof bag, along with the hard drives and the single photograph of her he couldn't bear to leave. His camera, unused for so long, found its way around his neck, a reflex he didn't question. He hesitated at the shelf where he kept his satellite phone, the one connection to the outside world he'd maintained but never used, charging it monthly in case of emergencies, but leaving it otherwise untouched. After a moment's consideration, he added it to his pack. If they survived, the kit would need professional wildlife rehabilitation. And perhaps, after 400 days, it was time to hear another human voice besides the one in his memories. The fox kit watched his preparations from its nest, too weak to move, but tracking his movements with those intelligent amber eyes. When everything was ready, Marcus gently lifted the makeshift bed, cradling it against his chest where the kit could feel his heartbeat. A wild animal would normally fight such confinement, but either from weakness or some deeper understanding, the kit remained still, its small body conforming to the protective curve of Marcus's arms. He paused at the door, looking back at the space that had contained his grief for so long. The photographs on the walls, his professional work interspersed with personal snapshots of Elena laughing by alpine lakes, pointing excitedly at rare birds, sleeping peacefully beside campfires. The bookshelves lined with field guides and poetry collections, her passion for both science and art evident in the well-worn spines. The river stones arranged on the windowsill, collected from every major expedition they'd undertaken together. In that moment of farewell, Marcus realized he wasn't leaving Elena behind. She was coming with him, not just in the journals and photographs he carried, but in the compassion that had driven him to save this fox kit, in the parts of himself that were finally awakening after a long, cold winter of the soul. The heat hit him like a physical blow as he stepped onto the porch. What had been distant flames were now a towering wall of orange and red, advancing with unnatural speed as the wind fed their hunger. The route to his truck was already cut off, a fallen, burning pine blocking the path. The only way out was east, toward the river that lay 3 miles beyond the creek. If they could reach it, the water might offer protection the narrow creek could not. As Marcus stepped off the porch, a sound escaped him. Not quite a word, not quite a cry, but the first vocalization to pass his lips in 400 days. The fox kit's ears perked at the sound, its head turning up toward his face as if in recognition of the significance of this moment. The journey through the burning forest became a gauntlet of split-second decisions. Marcus moved with the instincts of someone who had spent a lifetime in these woods, identifying safe passages where others might see only chaos and destruction. Years of tracking wildlife had taught him to read the land, to recognize natural fire breaks, to understand how terrain affected the movement of both animals and flames. The smoke thickened around them, turning day to twilight. Ash fell like gray snow, coating Marcus's hair and shoulders. The fox kit burrowed deeper into the sweater, seeking protection from the acrid air. Occasionally, Marcus would stop to dampen a corner of the fabric with water from his bottle, holding it over the kit's sensitive nose to filter the worst of the smoke. The weight of the fox kit against his chest became his anchor to the present. preventing him from surrendering to the hypnotic beauty of the flames or the crushing memories of the last time he'd fled through these trees, carrying another broken body. Each time his thoughts threatened to spiral toward that dark day, the kit would stir or make a small sound, pulling him back to the immediate challenge of survival. They passed the charred remains of a deer that hadn't outrun the flames, its body contorted in a final desperate leap. Marcus averted his eyes, quickening his pace. Not all stories in nature had happy endings. This was something he and Elena had accepted in their work, documenting both the brutal and beautiful aspects of wilderness. But today, with this small life dependent on him, Marcus refused to accept defeat. Halfway to the river, the smoke became a living entity, wrapping around them like a shroud. Marcus pulled his shirt over his nose and mouth, hunching his body to create a pocket of clearer air for the kit. Each breath became a struggle, each step a negotiation with exhausted muscles. The world narrowed to the small circle of ground before his feet and the precious bundle against his chest. A sudden crack overhead sent Marcus diving forward, rolling to protect the kit as a massive branch, consumed by fire, crashed to the ground where they had stood seconds before. The impact sent a shower of embers around them, small burns peppering Marcus's exposed hands and neck. He ignored the pain, checking frantically to ensure the fox was unharmed before pushing onward with renewed urgency. The terrain grew steeper as they approached the river valley, loose shale sliding beneath Marcus's boots. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself at the last moment, his muscles screaming in protest at movements they hadn't performed in months. His photographer's eye couldn't help but register the apocalyptic beauty surrounding them. The contrast of orange flame against black smoke, the eerie glow illuminating the forest from within, the strange, terrible majesty of destruction and renewal playing out in real time. In another life, he would have been capturing these images, telling this story through his lens. When the trees finally thinned and the glint of water appeared through the smoke, Marcus allowed himself the first moment of hope. The river was wider than he remembered, swollen with early snowmelt from the mountains. Its current ran fast and cold, dangerous under normal circumstances, but now a lifeline. On the riverbank, Marcus paused. The fox kit looked up at him, its breathing labored, but its eyes still alert. The choice before them was impossible. Risk drowning in the frigid water or face certain death in the flames. The fire had nearly caught up to them, its heat blistering against his back, its roar drowning out even the sound of the rushing water. In that moment, Marcus did what he had not done in 400 days. He spoke. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice raw and strange to his own ears. "Trust me." The words felt like pebbles in his throat, rough and unfamiliar after so long unused. But once released, they seemed to break something open inside him, a dam holding back not just his voice, but his capacity to feel, to connect, to live rather than merely exist. With the fox kit secured inside his jacket, pressed against his chest, Marcus waded into the river. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending shocks of pain through his limbs. The current immediately tried to pull him under, to sweep him downstream toward the falls. He fought against it, each step a battle against the water's power. Memories of river crossings with Elena flashed through his mind, her teaching him to move diagonally with the current rather than fighting directly against it. To test each foothold before committing his weight, to keep his center of gravity low. Her voice seemed to guide him now, as real as the roar of the fire behind them. "Angle your body, that's it. Small steps, feel the riverbed. You're doing great." When the river reached his chest, a massive tree fully engulfed in flames crashed into the water behind them. A wave of steam and burning debris washed over them. Marcus had just enough time to turn his back to it, shielding the kit with his body before the impact sent them both beneath the surface. The world became a chaotic swirl of bubbles and current, light and dark. Marcus kicked desperately toward what he hoped was the surface. One arm wrapped protectively around the kit while the other fought the water. His lungs burned, demanding air that wasn't available. The weight of his pack dragged him downward, but he refused to release it. Elena's journals were there, her last words, her essence captured on paper. Underwater, suspended between fire and drowning, Marcus made a choice that would alter the course of not just his life, but the lives of countless others. A choice that would break his silence forever. With a powerful kick, he angled his body toward a fallen log extending from the opposite bank, reaching for it with his free hand while protecting the kit with his other arm. His fingers found purchase on the rough bark, clinging with the desperation of someone who had rediscovered a reason to live. With strength he didn't know he still possessed. Marcus pulled himself and his precious cargo toward the surface, toward air, toward life. As his head broke the water, he gasped, not just for oxygen, but in a primal affirmation of existence. The fox kit stirred against his chest, its tiny body trembling but alive. Together, they dragged themselves onto the far bank, beyond the reach of the flames that now consumed the forest they had just escaped. Collapsing on the rocky shore, Marcus curled his body around the kit, providing what warmth he could as they both shivered from cold and exhaustion. The fire raged on the opposite bank, unable to cross the natural barrier of the river. For the moment, they were safe. What happened next would become the stuff of local legend, a tale of redemption so unlikely that many would refuse to believe it. But for Marcus and the small fox kit fighting for survival in his arms, the truth of what transpired in that river would change everything. Dawn broke over the eastern ridge, painting the smoke-filled sky in surreal hues of crimson and gold. Marcus lay motionless on the riverbank, his body a shield around the fox kit that miraculously still breathed against. His chest. The night had passed in a haze of exhaustion and vigilance. Moments of fitful sleep interrupted by the kit's whimpers or the crack of falling trees as the fire continued its relentless consumption of the forest across the river. Every muscle in Marcus's body protested as he finally pushed himself to sitting. His clothes had dried stiff with river water and ash, his skin beneath them raw from burns and scratches he didn't remember receiving. The camera around his neck had somehow survived the journey, though water droplets clouded the viewfinder. Elena's voice whispered in his memory, "The equipment can be replaced. You cannot." The fox kit stirred as Marcus gently unwrapped it from his jacket. In the clear light of morning, its injuries looked simultaneously better and worse than he had feared. The burns were superficial rather than deep, but infection had definitely set in along its flank, the skin hot and swollen beneath his careful fingers. Its breathing came too quick, too shallow. Without proper care, the kit wouldn't survive another day. "Hang on, little one," Marcus murmured, his voice still strange to his own ears after the long silence. "We're not done fighting yet." He surveyed their surroundings with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime reading landscapes. The river curved away to the south, its far banks still engulfed in flames that showed no sign of abating. To the east, where they now found themselves, the terrain rose sharply into the foothills of the Cascade Range. Territory Marcus knew existed, but had never explored during his time in the cabin. Somewhere beyond those hills lay civilization, towns, roads, people who could help the fox kit, and who would ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. The satellite phone weighed heavy in his pack. One call would bring rescue, for the kit, certainly, and for himself, though he wasn't sure he wanted or deserved saving. His fingers hovered over the device before returning it to his pack. Not yet. There was another option, one that wouldn't immediately thrust him back into the world of human connection he'd so deliberately abandoned. Elena's voice came to him again, as clear as if she stood beside him. "Remember the old fire lookout? Anderson Peak. It should be due east, maybe 5 miles." The memory surfaced from their preliminary scouting of the area before purchasing the cabin. They'd hiked up to the decommissioned fire lookout, a relic from the days before satellite monitoring, perched on a rocky outcropping with commanding views of the surrounding wilderness. It had been abandoned by the Forest Service decades ago, but maintained by a local historical society. Basic supplies, a first aid kit, even a small solar panel for emergency power, all might still be there, if they could reach it. Decision made, Marcus carefully returned the Fox kit to its nest inside his jacket, securing it close to his body heat. With one last look at the burning forest that had been his home and prison for the past year, he turned his back on the river and began the ascent into the foothills. The climb was brutal. What might have been challenging even for the fit, experienced hiker Marcus had once been became nearly impossible for the man he'd become. Muscles atrophied from disuse, lungs weakened by months of stillness and now damaged by smoke. Every step upward sent pain shooting through his legs, every breath burned in his chest. Only the warm weight of the kit against his heart kept him moving when his body begged for surrender. By midday, the smoke had thinned enough to reveal glimpses of the landscape below. The fire had spread farther than Marcus had imagined possible, a sea of flame stretching to the western horizon. His cabin was certainly gone, along with the memories and ghosts it had contained. He should have felt loss, but instead, an unexpected lightness filled him, as if the physical destruction of his past had somehow freed him from its emotional weight. The Fox kit grew restless as the day wore on, its fever clearly worsening despite the water and small amounts of protein mixture Marcus continued to administer. Its once bright eyes had grown dull, its small body trembling continuously. Fear gripped Marcus's heart, a feeling so long absent that he almost didn't recognize it. After surviving the fire, after carrying this tiny life through river and flame, would he still fail to save it? "Stay with me," he whispered to the kit, his voice growing stronger with use. "Just a little farther. I promise." As the sun began its descent toward the western ridgeline, casting long shadows across the mountainside, Marcus finally spotted it. The weathered silhouette of the fire lookout perched on an outcropping ahead. Relief nearly brought him to his knees. Another hour, maybe less, and they would reach shelter. The final approach to the lookout required navigating a narrow ridge path with steep drop-offs on either side. In his prime, Marcus would have crossed it without hesitation. Now, with exhaustion clouding his judgment and precious cargo depending on his sure-footedness, each step became a calculated risk. Loose shale shifted beneath his boots, sending small cascades of rock into the void below. Twice he nearly lost his balance, catching himself at the last moment with a desperation born of responsibility rather than self-preservation. The lookout stood like a sentinel against the darkening sky, a simple square structure raised on stilts, its wraparound deck offering 360-degree views of the wilderness. Weather and neglect had taken their toll on the once proud building. Peeling paint and missing shingles spoke of years without proper maintenance. But it stood solid on its foundation, a human outpost in the wilderness that now represented their only hope. Marcus climbed the wooden stairs slowly, testing each one before trusting it with his weight. The door hung slightly ajar, its padlock long since rusted away. With a deep breath that was part prayer, part preparation for disappointment, he pushed it open. The interior was sparse but intact. A single room with windows on all sides, a simple cot against one wall, a small wood stove in the center, and a desk positioned to take advantage of the panoramic views. Dust covered every surface, disturbed only by the tracks of mice and other small creatures who had made the lookout their occasional home. But to Marcus, it looked like salvation. Moving with renewed purpose, he cleared the cot of debris and gently laid the fox kit upon it, still nestled in Elena's sweater. The animal's eyes flickered open briefly, meeting Marcus's gaze with what he couldn't help interpreting as trust, before closing again in exhaustion. A thorough search of the lookout yielded more than he had dared hope for. A first aid kit with unexpired antiseptic and antibiotics, bottled water, emergency rations, even a small solar-powered radio. The Historical Society had maintained it better than its exterior suggested. In a locker beneath the desk, Marcus found the greatest treasure of all, a wildlife management handbook with a chapter on treating injured animals. As night fell, the fire lookout became an island of warmth in the darkness. The small wood stove radiated heat from a fire built with the emergency supply of dry wood stacked neatly beside it. By its light, Marcus cleaned the kit's wounds again, applying antibiotic ointment according to the handbook's instructions. He mixed water with the protein powder to create a gruel that he painstakingly fed to the weakened animal, drop by drop. Outside, the world continued to burn. From this elevation, the fire spread below them like a living map, consuming everything in its path. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts, evacuation orders for communities Marcus had forgotten existed, reports of firefighters battling the blaze on multiple fronts, warnings about air quality and road closures. The human drama playing out beyond his self-imposed isolation suddenly felt both foreign and familiar, like a language once known but long unused. As midnight approached, Marcus sat beside the cot, one hand resting gently on the fox kit's side to monitor its breathing. The fever still raged, but the animal had taken more water and food than before, a small victory that felt monumental after the day's ordeal. For the first time in 400 days, Marcus found himself speaking aloud, not in the necessary whispers of survival, but in the forgotten cadence of storytelling. When I was younger, he told the kit, before I met Elena, I spent a summer tracking a family of foxes much like yours. The mother had 5 kits, an unusually large litter, and I became obsessed with documenting their development. I built a blind near their den and spent hours each day just watching, photographing, learning their habits. The kit's ear twitched, as if listening. There was one kit, the smallest of the litter, that reminded me of you. The others would tumble and play while this one watched from the den entrance, calculating. When it finally joined in, its movements were precise, deliberate. It never wasted energy on unnecessary actions. Marcus smiled at the memory, his hand automatically reaching for the camera that hung, still damp but intact, around his neck. That little fox taught me the most important lesson of wildlife photography. Patience reveals truth. The dramatic moments, the hunting and playing and fighting, those are easy to capture. But the quiet moments, the contemplative pauses, the subtle communications, those tell the real story. As he spoke, Marcus realized he was no longer talking just to the fox kit, but to himself, to the empty space beside him where Elena should have been, to the stars visible through the lookout's windows. Words he had bottled inside for more than a year poured out in a quiet stream, washing away layers of silence like water over stone. He spoke of Elena, of her laugh that started as a giggle and built to a full-bodied sound of joy, of her insistence on carrying chocolate on every expedition for emergencies. Though the emergencies were usually just beautiful sunsets she wanted to make more perfect, of her uncanny ability to spot wildlife before anyone else, as if the creatures of the forest recognized her as one of their own. He spoke of their last day together, details he had locked away in the darkest corners of his mind now finding voice in the fire-lit lookout. The routine morning, the casual decision to split up to photograph different sections of the meadow, the thunder of the startled elk herd, his sprint through the forest at the sound of her scream, arriving moments too late. "I carried her for 3 miles, he told the fox kit, his voice breaking. "Just like I carried you. But I couldn't save her. By the time I reached the ranger station, she was gone." The kit stirred in its sleep, a small paw stretching out to touch Marcus's hand, as if in comfort or understanding. He gently stroked its head, feeling the fever still burning beneath the fur, but noticing too a new steadiness in its breathing. "I thought silence would honor her somehow," Marcus continued. "As if by not speaking, not engaging with the world, I was creating a space where her absence could exist untouched. But that's not what she would have wanted." He reached for his pack, pulling out Elena's journal, the last one she had filled before her death. Its pages were slightly warped from the river crossing, but still legible, her handwriting flowing across them with the energy that had characterized everything she did. "Life speaks in 1,000 voices," Marcus read aloud, finding the passage he had read so many times in silence. The wind through pine needles, the warning call of a jay, the subtle shift of light across water. To be alive is to listen, to respond, to add your voice to the chorus. Silence has its place, as pause, as respect, as the space between notes that gives music its meaning. But prolonged silence is absence, and absence is not what we were made for. The fox kit's eyes opened briefly, meeting Marcus's gaze with a clarity that hadn't been there before. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding beyond words, a recognition of shared survival. "We're going to make it," Marcus promised, as much to himself as to the kit. "Both of us. And tomorrow I'll make the call. It's time to rejoin the world." As dawn approached, Marcus stepped onto the lookout's deck, camera in hand. The fire still burned below, but from this vantage point, he could see beyond it to untouched forest, to distant mountains, to possibilities he had thought forever closed to him. For the first time in 400 days, he raised the viewfinder to his eye and pressed the shutter, capturing not just the devastation, but the first light breaking over the horizon, the promise of renewal that had always been Elena's favorite subject. Inside, the fox kit slept peacefully, its fever finally broken in the night. And on the desk lay the satellite phone, ready for the call that would end their isolation and begin whatever came next. What neither Marcus nor the fox kit could know was that their journey had only just begun, that the fire that had nearly claimed their lives would lead to discoveries that would challenge everything Marcus thought he understood about the wilderness he had spent his life documenting, about the nature of grief and healing, and about the unexpected ways life finds to continue, even in the midst of devastation. The satellite phone felt unnaturally heavy in Marcus's hand as he punched in the emergency number. After 400 days of self-imposed silence, the prospect of speaking to another human being, explaining himself, answering questions, sent a wave of anxiety through him that nearly rivaled the fear he'd felt facing the wildfire. Cascade County Emergency Services. What's your situation? The voice that answered was female, efficient, slightly strained, undoubtedly from handling countless calls related to the wildfire. Marcus's voice caught, unused to addressing anyone but the Fox Kit. He cleared his throat and tried again. My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm at the old Anderson Peak fire lookout with an injured Fox Kit. We escaped the fire yesterday by crossing the river. A pause. Mr. Thorne? Marcus Thorne, the wildlife photographer. The professional tone gave way to surprise. Something cold settled in Marcus's stomach. Of course. In his isolation, he'd forgotten that his disappearance might have been noticed, might have become a story in itself. The renowned photographer who vanished after his partner's death, probably presumed dead himself by now. Yes, he managed. That's me. Sir, you've been listed as missing for over a year. The dispatcher's voice softened. There are people who have been looking for you. Marcus glanced at the Fox Kit, still sleeping on the cot, its breathing steadier than the night before. I wasn't missing, he said simply. I was away. But that's not important now. This kit needs medical attention, and the fire. We're aware of the fire situation, sir. Professionalism returned to her voice. It's being called the Cascade Complex Fire. Over 80,000 acres burned so far, multiple communities evacuated. We have crews coming in from 3 states. 80,000 acres. The number stunned Marcus into momentary silence. His small corner of wilderness, his sanctuary and prison, was just a fraction of the devastation. Can you confirm your location again? The Anderson Peak lookout? Yes, about 5 miles east of Raven Creek. The kit has burns and an infection. I've been treating it with supplies I found here, but it needs proper care. Understood. Wildlife Rescue has been working with us on animal casualties from the fire. I'll coordinate with them. Keys clicked in the background. Given your location and the fire conditions, helicopter extraction is the safest option. ETA approximately 3 hours. Can you make yourself visible from the air? Any distress signals or markers? Marcus stepped out onto the lookout's deck, surveying the clearing around the structure. The lookout itself should be visible. I'll create additional markers. Good. Stay on this frequency. I'll patch you through to Wildlife Rescue while we dispatch the helicopter. Another voice came on the line. Male, older, with the measured cadence of someone who had spent a lifetime working with injured animals. Mr. Thorne? This is Dr. Alan Miyazaki with Cascade Wildlife Rescue. I understand you have an injured Fox Kit. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus described the kit's condition in detail, following Dr. Miyazaki's instructions for additional treatment with the supplies available at the lookout. The conversation was focused, practical, a relief after the personal questions Marcus had feared. You've done well, Dr. Miyazaki concluded. Better than most would have in your situation. I'll be on the helicopter when it arrives. Keep the kit warm and continue the hydration schedule we discussed. After ending the call, Marcus set about making the lookout visible from the air. He hung Elena's red rain jacket from the highest point of the structure and cleared debris from the small helipad that had once served the fire spotters. Inside, he gathered their few possessions: the journals, the camera, the makeshift nest that had become the kit's home. The fox stirred as he worked, its amber eyes tracking his movements with growing alertness. Its fever had broken during the night, and while the wounds still looked angry, the infection seemed to be responding to the antibiotics. We're getting out of here, Marcus told it, kneeling beside the cot. Someone's coming to help you. A doctor who knows exactly what you need. The kit's ears perked forward at the sound of his voice. Over their brief time together, it had grown increasingly responsive to him, turning toward his voice, accepting food and water from his hands without resistance. Dr. Miyazaki had explained that young foxes imprint easily, especially when separated from their mothers, a fact that complicated their eventual return to the wild. Return to the wild. The phrase echoed in Marcus's mind as he stroked the kit's head with a gentle finger. The wilderness that had been this fox's home no longer existed in the form it had known. Like Marcus himself, it would have to find its way in a changed landscape. "We'll figure it out," he promised, though he had no idea what awaited either of them beyond this temporary sanctuary. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Marcus found himself pacing the small confines of the lookout, alternating between checking on the kit and scanning the sky for signs of the promised helicopter. The fox watched his restless movements with what seemed like curiosity, occasionally attempting to stand before settling back into its nest, still too weak for sustained activity. To distract himself, Marcus turned to what had once been second nature: photography. The camera had dried completely overnight, and while he worried about internal damage from the river crossing, the mechanics seemed intact. Through the lookout's windows, he captured images of the transformed landscape, the blackened forest to the west, the untouched wilderness to the east, the stark line of the river dividing destruction from salvation. When he turned the lens toward the fox kit, something shifted inside him. The viewfinder, once a barrier that had allowed him to observe life without participating in it, now became a window connecting him to this small creature that had somehow broken through his carefully constructed isolation. He photographed the kit's alert ears, its intelligent eyes, the delicate curve of its body within Elena's sweater. With each frame, he felt something long dormant awakening. Not just his photographer's eye, but his capacity to see beauty in vulnerability, strength in survival. The distant thrum of helicopter blades finally broke the stillness of the afternoon. Marcus stepped onto the deck, waving Elena's jacket like a flag as the aircraft approached. The fox kit, startled by the noise, pressed itself deeper into the nest, its earlier confidence replaced by instinctive fear. "It's okay," Marcus soothed, gathering the bundle into his arms. "This is help arriving. I won't let anything happen to you." The helicopter, emblazoned with emergency services markings, hovered above the small clearing before setting down with precision on the helipad. Rotors still spinning, the side door slid open to reveal a team of 3. A pilot remaining at the controls, a medical technician in standard emergency gear, and an older Japanese-American man carrying a specialized animal transport case who Marcus assumed must be Dr. Miyazaki. The doctor approached first, his movements careful but confident as he took in the situation. Marcus's disheveled appearance, the fox kit cradled protectively against his chest. "Mr. Thorne," he said with a slight bow, "I'm Alan Miyazaki. May I see our patient?" There was a gentleness in his manner that immediately put Marcus at ease. He nodded, carefully unwrapping the fox kit to allow the doctor's examination. Dr. Miyazaki's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, inspecting wounds, all while maintaining a soothing murmur that seemed to calm both the kit and Marcus. "Remarkable," the doctor said finally. "Given what you've both been through, I'd say this little one is doing surprisingly well. You made good decisions under extremely difficult circumstances." Relief washed through Marcus with unexpected force. Will the kit survive?" "I believe so, yes. The burns are superficial, and you caught the infection before it became systemic. With proper care, there's every reason to expect a full recovery. Dr. Miyazaki glanced up, his kind eyes assessing Marcus with the same professional attention he'd given the fox. And you? Any injuries we should address? Marcus shook his head, though his body ached in a dozen places from the ordeal. I'm fine. Just get the kit, whatever help it needs. The medical technician stepped forward. Sir, we should still check you out. Smoke inhalation can have delayed effects, and you mentioned swimming through the river during active fire conditions. Later, Marcus said firmly. The kit first. Dr. Miyazaki nodded, understanding the priority. We need to transport both of you to our facility in Cascade Falls. The kit will need ongoing treatment, and frankly, Mr. Thorne, you look like you could use some care yourself. The mention of Cascade Falls, the nearest town of any size, about 30 miles from his former cabin, sent a jolt of anxiety through Marcus. Returning to civilization meant questions, explanations, human connections he'd deliberately severed. Is there somewhere else? He asked, his voice tight. Somewhere quieter? Dr. Miyazaki exchanged a glance with the technician before responding. Our wildlife rehabilitation center is actually outside town, about 5 miles into the national forest. Very private. We have a small residential facility where volunteers and researchers sometimes stay. He paused, studying Marcus's face. You'd be welcome there while your young friend recovers. No pressure, no questions you don't want to answer. The offer hung in the air between them. A bridge back to the world that acknowledged Marcus's need for space, for gradual reintegration. He looked down at the Fox kit, now being gently transferred to the specialized carrier under Dr. Miyazaki's supervision. Its eyes found his, that same intelligent gaze that had connected with him through fire and water. All right, Marcus said finally, but I need to stay with the kit. Of course, Dr. Miyazaki agreed. In fact, given the imprinting that's clearly occurred, your presence will likely aid in its recovery. The journey to the helicopter felt like crossing a threshold, not just physically leaving the lookout, but stepping beyond the boundaries of his self-imposed exile. Marcus paused at the doorway, taking one last look at the simple space that had sheltered them in their moment of greatest need. On impulse, he raised his camera and captured a final image. Sunlight streaming through dust motes, the rumpled cot, the small wood stove still radiating warmth. A sanctuary found and left behind. The helicopter rose above the mountain with a surge that pressed Marcus back into his seat. Through the window, he watched the lookout grow smaller. The Cascade Wildlife Rehabilitation Center materialized from the forest, like something from another world. A collection of wooden buildings nestled among towering pines, connected by winding gravel paths and surrounded by a series of carefully designed enclosures. As the helicopter descended toward a clearing marked with a large H, Marcus caught glimpses of movement within those enclosures. The silhouettes of deer, the distinctive waddle of waterfowl, the loping gait of what might have been a young bear. Dr. Miyazaki noticed his interest. We're currently caring for 63 animals displaced or injured by the fire, he explained over the noise of the rotors. That number grows daily. This is the largest wildlife disaster we've faced in the center's 20-year history. The helicopter touched down with a gentle bump. Before the rotors had fully stopped, a team in matching green uniforms rushed forward with a gurney for the Fox kit's carrier, and to Marcus's surprise, a second one clearly intended for him. Standard procedure, Dr. Miyazaki assured him, noting his hesitation. Everyone coming from the fire zone gets a full medical check. Smoke inhalation can cause damage you won't feel until later. Too exhausted to argue, Marcus allowed himself to be helped onto the gurney. The fox kit's carrier was placed on a cart beside him, positioned so that they could maintain visual contact during the short journey to the main building. The animal's eyes remained fixed on Marcus, a connection that seemed to transcend their brief acquaintance. The main building, a sprawling single-story structure with a central atrium open to the sky, buzzed with activity. Staff moved purposefully between examination rooms, carrying supplies, consulting charts, speaking in the hushed, efficient tones of medical professionals everywhere. The air smelled of antiseptic and pine, an oddly comforting combination. They were directed to adjacent examination rooms, separated by a glass partition, allowing Marcus to watch as Dr. Miyazaki and a younger veterinarian carefully transferred the fox kit to an examination table. A nurse practitioner named Leah introduced herself to Marcus and began a thorough assessment of his condition, asking questions about his smoke exposure, checking his lungs, cleaning and dressing the various cuts and burns he'd accumulated during their escape. "You're dehydrated and showing moderate smoke inhalation effects," she concluded, hanging a bag of fluids on a stand beside him. "Nothing critical, but you'll need this IV, oxygen therapy overnight, and rest. A lot of rest." Through the glass, Marcus could see Dr. Miyazaki performing a more comprehensive examination of the fox kit than had been possible at the lookout. Blood samples were taken, wounds cleaned and redressed, a tiny IV inserted into one delicate leg. Throughout the procedure, the kit remained surprisingly calm, its gaze repeatedly returning to Marcus as if for reassurance. "Your friend is doing remarkably well, all things considered," Leah commented, following his line of sight. "Dr. M says you kept it alive against incredible odds." Marcus shook his head slightly. "We kept each other alive." The simple statement seemed to satisfy Leah, who nodded as if this made perfect sense. That's how it works sometimes. The ones we save end up saving us right back. The next hours passed in a blur of medical procedures, quiet conversations, and gradually diminishing anxiety. Marcus was moved to a small private room adjacent to the center's intensive care unit where the fox kit had been settled. Through another glass partition, he could see the tiny creature resting in an incubator-like environment, connected to monitoring equipment that tracked its vital signs. Dr. Miyazaki had explained that while the kit's condition was stable, the next 24 hours would be critical in determining its long-term prognosis. As evening fell, the center grew quieter. Most of the day's staff departed, replaced by a skeleton crew of overnight caregivers. Marcus's room, with its simple bed, desk, and attached bathroom, reminded him of university field stations he'd stayed in during his early career. Functional, clean, designed for researchers rather than patients. The familiarity was oddly comforting. A soft knock at his door roused Marcus from a light doze. Dr. Miyazaki entered, carrying a tray with a bowl of what smelled like homemade soup and a thick slice of bread. "My wife's miso soup," he explained, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Better than anything from our cafeteria. She sends it for special patients." Marcus sat up, suddenly aware of his hunger. "Thank you. For everything." Dr. Miyazaki pulled a chair beside the bed and sat, his movements deliberate, unhurried. In the quieter setting, Marcus could better appreciate the man's presence. The calm competence in his weathered face, the compassionate intelligence in his eyes. "Your fox is responding well to treatment," the doctor said. "The antibiotics are controlling the infection, and the burn dressings are promoting healing. Barring complications, I believe we're looking at a full recovery." Relief washed through Marcus. That's good news. Indeed. Dr. Miyazaki studied him for a moment. "You've formed a strong bond with this animal in a very short time. That's not uncommon in extreme circumstances, but it does raise questions about the kit's future rehabilitation and release. Marcus tensed. What do you mean? Wild animals that imprint on humans often struggle to readapt to their natural environment. They lose their fear of people, which makes them vulnerable to those who might harm them. They may fail to develop hunting skills, territory defense, appropriate mating behaviors. The doctor's tone remained gentle but direct. In some cases, full rehabilitation isn't possible. So what happens then? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sometimes they become permanent residents of facilities like ours. Educational ambassadors, we call them. Or they're placed in sanctuaries where they can live safely without full wild reintegration. Dr. Miyazaki paused. It's too early to make that determination for your fox. But I wanted you to understand the possibilities. Marcus nodded slowly, processing this information. The parallel to his own situation wasn't lost on him. After more than a year of self-imposed isolation, his own rehabilitation back into human society remained an open question. There's something else you should know, Dr. Miyazaki continued. When we ran standard tests on the kit, we found some unusual genetic markers. Nothing alarming, but distinctive enough that I sent samples to a colleague at the university for further analysis. Unusual how? It appears to be a Sierra Nevada red fox, a subspecies once thought extinct in this region. They've been rediscovered in small numbers over the past decade, but sightings are extremely rare. If confirmed, your little friend represents an important data point for conservation efforts. Marcus absorbed this information. Remembering the kit's unusual coloration, its distinctive facial markings that had seemed somehow different from the red foxes he'd photographed in the past. What does that mean for its future? It means we'll take extra care with its rehabilitation plan, and it means your documentation of where you found it, under what circumstances, could be scientifically valuable. Dr. Miyazaki gestured toward the camera that lay on the desk where Marcus had placed it. I understand you're somewhat familiar with wildlife photography. A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's face at the understatement. Before his disappearance, he had been among the most respected wildlife photographers in the country. His work featured in National Geographic, Nature, and countless other publications. I've taken a few pictures in my time, he acknowledged. Then, perhaps when you're feeling stronger, you might consider helping us document the kit's recovery. For scientific purposes, Dr. Miyazaki added, as if sensing Marcus's hesitation. No pressure for anything beyond that. The invitation hung in the air between them. A small, manageable step back toward a world Marcus had deliberately left behind. Not a full return to his former life, but a purpose that connected to it, that honored Elena's memory without drowning in it. I'll think about it, he said finally. Dr. Miyazaki nodded, apparently satisfied with his response. Eat, rest. We can talk more tomorrow. He rose to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing, Mr. Thorne. There's a journalist staying at the center, Nora Chen from Wildlife Conservation Quarterly. She's documenting the fire's impact on local ecosystems. She may approach you at some point. Marcus felt his chest tighten. I'm not interested in being interviewed. I understand. I've asked the staff to respect your privacy. But in a place this size, with the current situation, complete anonymity may not be possible. The doctor's expression was sympathetic but realistic. Just so you're prepared. After Dr. Miyazaki left, Marcus ate the soup, rich and comforting, nothing like the basic provisions he'd subsisted on for the past year, and found himself drawn to the window overlooking the intensive care unit. The fox kit slept peacefully, its small chest rising and falling with reassuring regularity. A young woman in scrubs sat at a monitoring station nearby, occasionally checking readings and making notes. For the first time since their desperate flight through the burning forest, Marcus allowed himself to fully process what had happened. The destruction of his cabin, the loss of most of his possessions, the near-death experience that had somehow reconnected him to life. Elena's journals had survived, along with his camera and the hard drives containing their work together. Everything else was gone, consumed by the same indifferent natural forces that had taken Elena herself. Yet here he stood, alive, watching over a small creature that had somehow found him in the midst of chaos, that had given him a reason to break his silence, to move, to save himself in the process of saving it. Coincidence? Or something more meaningful? Elena would have seen significance in it. She had always believed in the interconnectedness of all living things, in the patterns and purposes that humans rarely perceived but that shaped the natural world. Nothing in nature happens in isolation, she used to say. Everything is conversation, call and response, action and reaction, across systems we barely understand. Marcus pressed his hand against the glass, as if he could reach through it to touch the sleeping fox. "What are you trying to tell me?" he whispered. Sleep claimed him eventually, deeper and more restful than any he'd experienced since before the fire. He dreamed of Elena, not as he usually did, of her final moments, but of her laughing beside a mountain stream, pointing excitedly at something he couldn't quite see, urging him forward with that infectious enthusiasm that had drawn him to her from the beginning. Morning arrived with soft light, filtering through blinds Marcus didn't remember closing. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't place himself. The bed too comfortable to be his cabin cot, the air too clean to be the smoke-filled lookout. Then memory returned in a rush, along with immediate concern for the fox kit. He sat up quickly, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles, and looked toward the glass partition. The incubator stood empty. Panic surged through him as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the protest from his battered body. Before he could stand, the door opened to reveal Dr. Miyazaki, accompanied by a younger woman in the center's green uniform, carrying a familiar bundle. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne." The doctor greeted him. "I thought you might like to see how your friend is doing." The woman stepped forward, carefully transferring the bundle to Marcus's arms. The fox kit, now clean, bandaged, and noticeably more alert, looked up at him with bright eyes that seemed to hold recognition. A small sound, somewhere between a chirp and a purr, vibrated from its throat as it pressed against his chest. "The night team reported steady improvement," Dr. Miyazaki explained. "This morning, he was showing signs of stress in the ICU environment, elevated heart rate, restlessness. We thought perhaps familiar contact might help." Marcus cradled the kit gently, feeling its warmth through the soft blanket that had replaced Elena's sweater. He? Yes, a male kit, approximately 7 weeks old based on dentition and development. Still dependent on parental care in the wild, but approaching the age where exploration beyond the den would be normal. The woman, her name tag identified her as Sophia, wildlife rehabilitation specialist, added, "He's been accepting formula from a syringe, which is excellent progress." The fact that he's seeking contact rather than withdrawing also suggests good neurological function despite his ordeal. As if to confirm this assessment, the kit squirmed in Marcus's arms, one small paw emerging from the blanket to press against his hand. The gesture felt deliberate, communicative. "He needs a name," Sophia suggested. For the records, and because we find it helps staff form appropriate connections during rehabilitation. Do you have any thoughts, since you're his rescuer? Marcus looked down at the fox, considering. In his professional life, he had been careful never to name his wild subjects, maintaining the observer's distance that allowed him to document without interfering. But this situation had moved beyond observation from the moment he'd opened his cabin door to find the injured kit on his porch. Phoenix, he said finally. His name is Phoenix. Dr. Miyazaki nodded approvingly. Rising from the ashes, it fits. Phoenix it is, Sophia agreed, making a note on her tablet. I'll update his charts and treatment plan. Speaking of which, we should continue his antibiotic schedule. She reached for the kit, but hesitated when Marcus instinctively tightened his hold. Perhaps you'd like to assist? Many of our volunteers help with basic care procedures. The offer surprised Marcus. In his experience, wildlife rehabilitation centers maintain strict protocols about handling, especially with endangered species. Dr. Miyazaki seemed to read his thoughts. Normally, we minimize human contact with rehabilitation candidates, the doctor acknowledged. But given the circumstances of Phoenix's rescue and the bond that's clearly formed, we're adapting our approach. Sometimes rigid adherence to protocol isn't what's best for the individual animal. Again, Marcus felt the parallel to his own situation, the standard expectations for grief and recovery that had felt so suffocating after Elena's death, that had driven him to the isolation of the cabin in the first place. I'd like to help, he said, the decision feeling both momentous and natural. With his care, with documenting his recovery, whatever you need. Something shifted in Dr. Miyazaki's expression, a subtle softening, a recognition. Excellent. Sophia will show you our procedures. And when you're feeling stronger, we can discuss a more formal volunteer role. He gestured to the wheelchair positioned near the door. But first, perhaps a tour of the facility. Phoenix should see his temporary home, and you might appreciate some fresh air. The center revealed itself gradually as Sophia pushed Marcus's wheelchair along accessible paths connecting the various buildings and enclosures. Despite his insistence that he could walk, both Dr. Miyazaki and the nurse practitioner had been firm about limiting physical exertion for at least another day. Phoenix remained in Marcus's lap, occasionally perking up at new sounds or scents, but showing no signs of distress at the activity around them. The rehabilitation center was larger and more comprehensive than it had appeared from the air. Beyond the main medical building lay specialized recovery areas for different species. A waterfowl pond with adjoining shelter, a series of progressively larger enclosures for mammals ranging from squirrels to coyotes, a separate building for raptors with attached flight conditioning spaces. Staff and volunteers moved purposefully between areas, carrying food, medication, and equipment. We normally house about 30 animals at any given time, Sophia explained as they passed an enclosure where a young bobcat watched them warily from a constructed den. Since the fire started, we've taken in more than twice that number, with more arriving daily. We're operating beyond capacity, but no one has the heart to turn away animals in need. Marcus nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. How many will be able to return to the wild? It depends. Some have injuries that will prevent release, a raptor that can't fly well enough to hunt, a deer with chronic respiratory damage from smoke. Others will recover, physically, but may have lost critical habitat. Sophia's voice held the balanced pragmatism of someone who had faced these realities before. We do our best for each one, whether that means rehabilitation and release or finding appropriate sanctuary placement. They paused beside a small, specialized enclosure near the fox rehabilitation area. Inside, two red fox kits slightly older than Phoenix played together, tumbling over logs and pouncing on enrichment toys designed to stimulate natural behaviors. Fire orphans, like Phoenix, Sophia said, found huddled in an abandoned den after their mother didn't return. They're responding well to rehabilitation and showing appropriate wariness of humans, which gives them a good chance at eventual release. Marcus watched the kits' fluid movements, their coordinated play that mimicked hunting behaviors they would need for survival. Would Phoenix develop those same skills, that same healthy fear of humans? Or had their connection already altered his developmental path? As if sensing his concern, Sophia added, "Each case is unique. We've had animals with strong initial human imprinting that still successfully transitioned back to wild behaviors through our staged rehabilitation program. It's too early to determine Phoenix's prospects." Their tour continued to the research building, a modern facility with laboratories, a small lecture hall, and offices for visiting scientists. "We collaborate with universities across the country," Sophia explained. "The center serves as a field station for studies on wildlife health, behavior, and conservation. Dr. Miyazaki divides his time between clinical work with our animals and research on wildlife disease transmission." Through an open door, Marcus glimpsed a woman about his age working intently at a computer, surrounded by maps and photographs of the fire zone. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore hiking clothes rather than the center's uniform. Something about her focused energy reminded him of Elena. Sophia followed his gaze. "That's Nora Chen, the journalist Dr. Miyazaki mentioned. She's been documenting wildlife displacement patterns since the fire started." The woman looked up at that moment, her eyes meeting Marcus's with immediate recognition. Before she could rise from her desk, Sophia smoothly continued their movement down the hallway, respecting Marcus's desire for privacy without drawing attention to it. Their final stop was a small cabin set apart from the main complex, nestled among pines at the edge of the property. Unlike the institutional efficiency of the medical buildings, the cabin had a lived-in warmth. A covered porch with rocking chairs, windows framed by simple curtains, a small garden of native plants attracting hummingbirds and butterflies. "This is our visiting researcher housing," Sophia said, guiding the wheelchair up a ramp to the porch. "Dr. Miyazaki thought you might prefer it to the recovery room once. You're medically cleared. It's more private than our volunteer dormitory, and it has a small kitchenette if you prefer to prepare your own meals." Marcus took in the peaceful setting, so different from the institutional environment he'd anticipated. "It's very generous. The center survives on generosity, both receiving and giving it," Sophia replied with a smile. "Dr. M believes healing happens in many forms. Sometimes what an animal or person needs most is simply the right space to recover at their own pace." As they returned to the medical building for Phoenix's treatment, Marcus found himself considering possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to contemplate since fleeing his burning cabin. The Wildlife Center offered something he hadn't expected to find: a middle path between complete isolation and full reintegration into society. A purpose connected to his past without being consumed by it. A community that respected boundaries while providing support. In his lap, Phoenix stirred, stretching one paw toward a butterfly that fluttered past. The gesture held such natural curiosity, such life-affirming interest in the world, that Marcus felt something long frozen within him begin to thaw. "I think we both might heal here," he murmured to the kit. What he couldn't yet know was how their parallel journeys of recovery would become intertwined with the larger story of the forest's renewal. or how the documentation of one small fox's fight for survival would ultimately lead him back to his own voice, and to discoveries about Elena's final research that would challenge everything he thought he understood about her death.